كفى وسلام على عباده الذين اصطفى أما بعد فقد قال الله تبارك وتعالى في القرآن المجيد والفرقان الحميد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم فوقاه الله سيئات ما مكروا وحاق بآل فرعون سوء العذاب وقال تعالى في شأن حبيبه الكريم إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما اللهم صل على سيدنا وشفيعنا ومولانا محمد معدن الجود والكرم وآله وأصحابه وبارك وسلم صلاة وسلاما عليك يا سيدي يا رسول الله. Inshallah, on Sunday night, we will look for the moon. Depending on whether or not we sight it, we will begin from that point onwards the final month of our lunar year, Dhul Hijjah. This is the month of Hajj, and inshallah, next week we'll talk a little bit more about that. The ritual and the obligation of Hajj, it is something that is instituted by Huzur sallallahu alaihi wasallam as part of the restoration of time itself, as part of the restoration of the tradition of the messengers of Allah alayhimus salatu wassalam. And we've been talking for a couple of weeks now about how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us stories of previous peoples, of previous communities, of previous prophets and messengers, to illustrate for us correct action, to instill within us a correct sense of values, and above all else, to give us a frame of reference for our daily lives. Someone recently asked me, he's a brother who accepted Islam at a later age, mashallah. He recently asked me how to deal with certain things that he notices in the community that doesn't sit well with him. And there are lots of things that perhaps we notice around us about our environment, especially an environment like this, that we're not pleased with, we're not happy with, but we just don't know how to deal with. There are two ways of dealing with something that we don't find to be appropriate for our lifestyle. The first way is to treat it as a fitna, which is what it is. Imam Muslim narrates from Hazrat Abu Bakr that Huzur sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, إِنَّمَا سَتَكُونُ فِتَنٌ أَلَا ثُمَّ تَكُونُ فِتْنَةٌ الْقَاعِدُ فِيهَا خَيْرٌ مِّنَ الْمَاشِي فِيهَا وَالْمَاشِي فِيهَا خَيْرٌ مِّنَ السَّاعِي إِلَيْهَا ألا فإذا نزلت أو وقعت فمن كان له إبل فليلحق بإبله ومن كانت له غنم فليلحق بغنمه ومن كانت له أرض فليلحق بأرضه إلى آخر الحديث كما قال صلى الله عليه وآله وصحبه وسلم. He narrates that Huzur sallallahu alayhi wasallam said that there will come such a fitna, to sit away from it is better than to walk amongst it, and to walk amongst it is better than to run towards it. And when this kind of fitna comes, then whoever is occupied with his camels should stick to his camels, whoever is occupied with his sheep should stick to his sheep, whoever is occupied with his land should stick to his land. O kama qala sallallahu alayhi wasallam. The intent behind this wording is that if you have an occupation, if you have something that you are engaged with, then just continue along with your business. Now, Huzur sallallahu alayhi wasallam gave us an idea of how to deal with fitan, how to deal with times of tribulation. But the ulama have interpreted these fitan that are talked about in this hadith to mean different things. Most of the time, the ulama are talking that this fitna means something that comes towards the end of time. But really, one condition that you have to observe in order for this to become that kind of fitna is when you live in an area, you live in a land, or you live amongst people to whom the message that you carry in your hearts has already been conveyed. And for people living in the United States and Europe and these kinds of countries, that's not the case. Not by a long shot. Rather, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Himself gives us an example of what it means to be an insider. To be an insider and to be a believer in your community while the rest of your community does not accept what you believe. Take, for example, part of the story of Musa alayhi salatu wasalam. Now there's a surah called Surah Ghafir. Another name is called Suratul Mu'min. This is another alternate name for this surah. Why is it called Suratul Ghafir? Because in the second ayat, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes Himself as Ghafirul Dham, the one who forgives sins abundantly. But it's also called Suratul Mu'min because the quintessential story of this surah is about one believing person. One believing person in the community of Fir'aun. This surah is named after him. So who is this person and what's the context of this story? When Hazrat Musa alayhi salatu wasalam was sent by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala back to Fir'aun to preach to him the message of the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to instill within him the idea that his claim to divinity was false and incorrect. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also endowed Musa alayhi salam with certain miracles. And when Musa alayhi salatu wasalam displayed these miracles, Fir'aun and his people, they dismissed it as just magic or just tricks of the eye. And so they arranged for their own magicians to have a competition with Musa alayhi salam. Musa alayhi salam, as we discussed last week, vanquished these magicians completely such that they were forced to admit that the message of Musa and Harun alayhi salam is true. After this, the people of Fir'aun, specifically the court members of Fir'aun, the inner sanctum, the inner circle of Fir'aun, they still refused to accept the message, and they decided that they would further impose themselves upon the Bani Israel in an attempt to drive away Musa or to kill his message. But of course we know, since he's sent by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this kind of thing was always impossible. Now, when Musa alayhi salatu wasalam received word of the decision of Fir'aun, he sought dua from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that protect us from every tyrannical, arrogant person. And in response to this dua, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when Fir'aun was debating with his people on what to do with Musa alayhi salam, there was one person whom Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala caused to stand up and openly argue and debate with Fir'aun. That is the person in this surah. We don't know the name of this person, but the narrations tell us that he was such a part of the inner circle of Fir'aun that he was what we call in Urdu the Chacha Zad Bhai of Fir'aun. That means that he's the son of Fir'aun's uncle. They're first cousins. What does this person say to refute the idea of Fir'aun? The first thing he says is an appeal to people's rational senses. The first thing he says in the surah is, why would you oppress or go after a man whose crime is nothing except that he says, I believe in Allah. I believe in one deity, one supreme being, one supreme creator. Another thing he does is he appeals to the rational nature of the more observant people amongst the people of Fir'aun. His message starts like this. He says, Ya qawmi lakumul mulk al-yawm zahirina fil ard faman yansuruna min ba'sillahi in ja'ana. He says, oh my people, you have the authority today, very apparently on the earth. But who will save us from the punishment of Allah if it comes to us? If some kind of punishment does come to us from this divine being that Musa alayhi salam claims is there, then who will save us from that? Because remember, Fir'aun had already been exposed as a fraud. How? because of his claim to divinity, why did he ask help from any magicians? Why did he need to ask help if he himself was a god, ma'adallah? Another thing is that his scheme to discredit Musa alayhi salam had already failed. So now he's in a bad position. At the same time, he doesn't want to go after Musa alayhi salam because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had placed some kind of fear of Musa alayhi salam in his heart. So now, this believing person is using the arguments that we ought to use with one another when we are seeking to convey this message to other people. Another thing that he does is he appeals to the historical factuality of events that the people of Fir'aun already knew. He says, وَقَالَ الَّذِينَ آمَنَ يَا قَوْمِ إِنِّي أَخَافُ عَلَيْكُمْ مِثْلَ يَوْمِ الْأَحْزَابِ. He says, my people, I fear for you something like what happened to the previous peoples on their days. The people of Ad, the people of Thamud, the people of Salih. Remember, these events, they seem very far away and difficult to accurately depict historically for our time. But for a time like ancient Egypt, these things were recent history. People knew about these things already. For the full details, I recommend that you recite this part of the Quran and take this wisdom for yourself. Basically, he gives examples. He gives examples that people can relate to. For example, the people of Egypt, if there's one person who believed in a single deity that they knew, it was Yusuf alayhi salam, who by the grace and the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually ended up becoming the ruler of Egypt. There was not a person in Egypt who did not know of him and his accomplishments. He appealed to their nature regarding Yusuf alayhi salam. He appealed to their nature regarding the sense of the fact that they know that this life is temporary and that the life of the akhirat is the life that is permanent. There are examples that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has illuminated for us from the examples that He has set up in other people. Don't just think that you have to sit away. Rather, your job is not to sit away, your job is to convey. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us even a drop of what these chosen servants of His were given. Allahumma salli wa sallim wa barik ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Please